Hello, Pittsburgh. I'm Zac Gibson, and this is Trib Live's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. As Kamala Harris builds support on her campaign trail, she set her sights on stopping the conservative blueprint for remaking America named Project 2025. Here to tell me about what a Project 2025 Pittsburgh could look like is Ryan Deto. Hi, Ryan.
Hey.
So give me a little recap on the Harris campaign. She's been out recently in the last few weeks since taking up the call to become the next presidential nominee for the Democrats. What does it really look like for her?
Yeah, well, she's hit the ground running. There's been a lot of momentum from her campaign. Polls have been replying, I guess. I say voters have been replying, and her polling is up, her approval is up, and she raised a ton of money, like over $200 million, directly to her campaign in the last week and couple days. And one of the things that she said the moment she decided to run basically was, pointing to this Project 2025, which is a 922 page document from a conservative group called the Heritage Foundation, a very influential conservative think tank. And this document claims to be the blueprint for the next Trump presidency, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said the next outline for a second Trump presidency. What has the Republican nominee Donald Trump said about this?
He denies it. He says that he has nothing to do with it. He says that it's by radical right-wingers that have written this. Now, it's the lines get a little blurred because the Heritage Foundation has historically had a huge part of Republican administrations, including Donald Trump's first administration. I believe 2/3 of his staffers had ties to the Heritage Foundation during his first presidency. So his vice presidential pick, who is also denied, this Project 2025, he has deep ties to the Heritage Foundation. J.D. Vance, who is the vice presidential pick for the Republicans, he wrote a foreword in the book for the Heritage Foundation founder that was just released. So it's the ties are there. Now the Republicans are obviously trying to distance themselves from it, but it's hard to deny that there aren't at least some historical ties, or not really historical, but like past ties, recent ties to this document.
So the document make up a 922 page document outlining pretty much the goal of Republicans in the next presidency should the Republican nominee win the ticket, a 30-chapter mandate for leadership. So it establishes a goal to assemble an army of aligned, vetted, trained, and prepared conservatives to go to work on day one to deconstruct the administrative state. Tell me about that and what that kind of outlines for the project.
Yeah, I mean, it outlines everything, really. It outlines all of their goals of, limiting immigration is a big goal of theirs, is changing how the Department of Justice works is a big goal of theirs. Really all the conservative priorities that we've heard about for years, limiting federal spending on programs. It wants to repeal the Infrastructure Act that was passed, $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Act, which helped pay for hollow bridge construction, stuff like that. I mean, it has all of these very conservative priorities that for basically, guidelines for a next administration.
Okay, so let's talk about the ABCs of Project 2025. Some of the main goals or points that I see lay out through the document are abortion restrictions, border policy, and cutting federal spending. Let's start with abortion. One of the main things that the conservative document opens with is encouraging the conservatives to celebrate the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and they call it just the beginning of the anti-abortion movement.
Right. And again, this is another long-time conservative priority. I mean, they are encouraged in this document to celebrate the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which has caused a lot of political headwinds, which caused a lot of backlash, I would say. It kind of wants to go beyond that. Now, it doesn't call, I think one of them, I've seen a lot of misinformation about this, it doesn't call for an outright national abortion ban. That doesn't call for that. The Republican platform also is not calling for that. Now, in the past, they had called for that. That is no longer there. They are moderating that position a little bit, probably due to the backlash. But either way, they're not calling for that. Now, there are specific things, though, that would restrict abortion. A lot of things, really, in this document. One of them is targeting mifepristone, which is the morning after pill, basically. Restricting that would have a pretty big effect on Pennsylvania, really effect on the country. That mifepristone accounts for, I believe, 55% of abortions in PA. So taking that away would have a huge impact on access to getting an abortion in the state. Not, that's probably the easiest and most common way that people are getting abortions. There's also, they want to target male abortions, which is another thing that also has a pretty big stay in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania only has 17 abortion clinics, so they're not that common. They really aren't. There's only two in southwestern Pennsylvania, and they're both within the city of Pittsburgh. So if you are living in Greene County, if you are living in Fayette County, and you're looking to have access to abortion, driving an hour into the city and scheduling an abortion there is one. It's not that easy. I mean, because there's so much more pressure on Pittsburgh to supply abortions now that West Virginia has outlawed them, now that it's a question that Ohio might also, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, Kentucky doesn't have any. So the closest place for them to go is Pittsburgh. That's just putting more pressure. So if you take away these other kind of non-abortion clinic abortions, that would really, I would just make it a lot harder for people to access something that they used to have plenty of access to.
Right. Well, there's also, with these other states having bans, there's also been an outlined crackdown on people traveling to states without these bans.
Right.
They're also seeking to have states require that they report where women who are seeking abortions live, and cutting their federal funds if they refuse to do so.
Right. And I mean, that's like kind of a crazy thing to say right out loud, that like basically if you travel from out of state, I mean, we're a country of United States. So like you don't have to cross a border. You don't have to go through a border patrol or anything like that when you cross into West Virginia or into Ohio. And so to basically be punished for doing that is like what is being laid out. That also has that guy could have an effect in the election too. Like it's not just the election of the Republicans and the Democrats on the top of the ticket. We have a state attorney general race that is part of this year as well. If it's between a Democrat, Eugene DePasquale, who's from here in Pittsburgh, and that attorney general race, it's unclear how that would be. DePasquale has said he won't prosecute, people coming over from the state, out of state to get abortions, but Dave Sunday has not really commented on it. He's not really touching that subject. But so I think that's kind of the very specific ways that talking about this project, if it were implemented, would affect abortion access in our state and in our region.
Let's move on to border policy. The document has outlined a lot of repeals and elimination for a lot of different types of policies. Tell me about these repeals and the effects that they could have.
Yeah. Well, as we've seen in this document, they are very specific immigration restriction policies. And so we could see they want to eliminate temporary protected status. These are undocumented immigrants that are here because they qualified for asylum. They had an abusive relationship there they were running away from. They ran away from a war, basically a dangerous war. So they were granted safety in the country. And there's 12,000 here in Pennsylvania, which isn't that many. But those people would be at risk, at threat for deportation if that program were to be eliminated. We also have the DACA program. They're called Dreamers. Basically, these are children who are undocumented immigrants that crossed the border when they were children at no fault of their own. Their parents brought them. They were like 3 years old. They had no say in the matter. That program would also be at risk. They're not trying to eliminate that program, but they're trying to make basically cuts to it. Now, those people, from what I've heard from immigration advocates, is that a lot of those undocumented immigrants, they work in sectors like nursing in our region. They have work permits. They're allowed work permits in this country. And, they work in these industries that are pretty vital to the region. I mean, nursing is a huge industry here. Healthcare is one of our biggest industries. And it's as advocates kind of pointed out that these are also sectors that have working shortages. And we've seen this. I mean, I've covered this. Trib has covered this a lot. Like, we've seen a lot of costs go up for healthcare because it's hard to find nurses, where we are getting traveling nurses. I think any kind of restriction on that would clearly have an effect on our economy. So that's something to think about. Another thing that we're seeing with any kind of immigration restriction is that a lot of these families have undocumented people and they have legal immigrants here. So if you split those families up, if you make that life harder, which I would argue conservatives want to do, they want to make these people's lives harder, which is, their prerogative. But if you do that, that just makes the region less attractive to immigrants. We don't have a lot of immigrants here compared to other regions. We're one of the lowest, actually, of any region in the country in terms of having foreign-born people live here.
Right. And this is a particular problem when Pittsburgh is struggling to find a positive population growth.
Right, which is a huge issue. I mean, people talk about this all the time. And I would argue that Republicans talk about it just as much as Democrats, if not more than Democrats, that one of our biggest problems with this region is a shrinking population. And we just aren't growing that fast. The last census, we did grow slightly, very slightly. And the only reason we even grew slightly during that region is because of international migration. Domestic migration is a net negative on our region. We have more people, we have more U.S. citizens from our region that move out of Pittsburgh every year than move into Pittsburgh. That has been happening for decades.
Right.
And so the only way to kind of keep that population slightly growing or stable or shrinking less fast than we want it to, the only thing been holding that up has been immigrants.
Okay. Just to wrap that all up, there are a lot of policies that will make effectively it pretty difficult for Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania to keep its positive growth happening when we're talking population, and there's a lot of cascading effects that can happen because of that.
Yeah, if we're just talking about trying to keep our population up, any kind of immigration restriction, any kind of making immigrants' lives harder here would make that harder. That's just a fact. That's a simple fact. So that's something voters have to think about when they go to the polls. And then, like I said, if people want that, then they want that, and they're going to pick that. If they don't, just something to think about.
Okay, let's move on to the last point that we're going to talk about today, which is cutting federal spending. That's been something that has been on the Republican agenda for quite some time. There are a lot of ways that it can affect people in Pittsburgh and the region.
Yeah, I mean, Pittsburgh, like a lot of cities, but maybe even more so, has been really reliant on some federal spending to help keep its services up. Pittsburgh Controller talked to me about how important federal spending has been in terms of maintaining city services after the pandemic. Federal spending has been really important for replacing lead lines, which is a huge problem in Pittsburgh that we've actually been making a lot of progress on. In part to $70 million from the federal government. That means local taxpayers don't have to pay as much for that. The Project 2025 suggests cutting a lot of federal programs, one of which would be the Head Start program, which helps low-income people pay for their children to go to preschool. How many people were... I believe there were
30,000 kids in Pennsylvania that are being funded through Head Start.
Right. They want to eliminate that program. So that would mean there'd be 30,000 low-income kids that could no longer afford to go to preschool or would have to find a different money to afford to go to preschool. There's also the SNAP program, which is formerly called food stamps. People are mostly aware of that. That is spending to help low-income families buy groceries, basically. The project wants to add more restrictions to that, basically add more requirements, then essentially that would lead to some cuts to that program. In Allegheny County would mean cuts to all, like, corresponding cuts for low-income people who get half off transit fares. So it would mean that a decent, a few thousand people probably, or maybe more in Allegheny County would then have less money for groceries, and they would have to spend more money on transit.
Okay. So just to give another number, there are more than 2 million Pennsylvanians that receive SNAP benefits, including 130,000 in Allegheny County. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to ask you to paint a picture for our listeners. If the people who authored Project 2025 got everything on this conservative wish list, what could we expect to see here in the Pittsburgh region? What would life be like?
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say too that like I doubt that even if this project is the actual blueprint that the Heritage Foundation wants it to be, even though the Trump campaign says it's not, there's no way they're going to get everything. That never happens. So I will say that everybody should know that going in. This is just what they want. They would have to flip the Senate. They'd have to maintain control of the House, probably have bigger margins of the House. But I think if it were implemented, or even if part of it were implemented, we would just see, we'd probably see cuts in immigration. We would see less access to abortion, and we would see cuts for low-income families, basically. That's what we would see. Maybe we would also see tax cuts. That's another thing that people want. That's something the Trump administration did last time when they were in power, that they cut taxes mostly for the wealthy, but really for everybody, I believe. And that's probably what we would see.
Okay. Well, Ryan, thank you for coming today to explain this document and all of what it could look like in a possible future.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zac Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.